the middle day of the conference, I sort of silently focus in on a subject. And today's subject, if you hadn't noticed, is about storytelling and understanding and the news. And the two gentlemen obviously were telling about storytelling. Geraldine, in her programs for kids basically, and her thoughts and a lot of the things she's working on are, how do you tell a story? How do you get people involved in a story? And our next speaker, I think, is one of America's great storytellers. And she's here to tell us all a story. Jackie Torrence.
Good morning. Storytelling is alive and doing very well. I don't ever want to hear from you again that storytelling needs a resurgence. It's everywhere. In every corner of the world, storytellers are back again. I found storytelling 30 years ago in a library as a reference librarian. It was snowing. The children's librarian didn't show up that morning. And the main librarian said to me, we need you in children's department. And I said, for what? Tell the stories. You're the only one here with a child. You'll know what to do. But I don't want to tell stories. I'll give you 5 minutes to get up there. I traveled the 10 steps to children's department, 17 children from 4 to 15, and settled them down and told a story that I heard when I was a child. And they liked it. And I liked them. And then they started coming into the library after that saying, where is that woman, that story lady? And then adults started calling me that story lady. And I liked that too. And then one day I looked back and discovered that I was a born storyteller. It happened to me at the feet of my grandparents, my grandmother and my grandfather. My grandmother used to say that my grandfather was the biggest liar God ever put breath into. And when my grandfather would start a story, my grandmother would say, excuse me, lightning's going to strike this room. I must leave. Well, I would check out the way lightning would get in, and closer I'd get to my grandfather, the more the story, more interesting the story became. 30 years I've been a storyteller. 7 videotapes, 8 audio tapes, and 1 book. The book's about the first 6 years of my life with my grandparents, who were my storytellers. I traveled all over this country, every state in this union, and abroad. And now I'm teaching storytelling. I have listened to many stories. The story that I have for you today is a story that I heard in my home state as I traveled from home to the Mecca of storytelling in Jonesboro, Tennessee. many years ago. This is a story that takes place many, many, many years ago. But it will live on because there'll always be somebody to tell it. I was driving a 1965 Dodge. I called it Duchess. Duchess turned onto Highway 19 West and immediately stopped. There was steam coming from her mouth. I lifted the hood. I knew absolutely nothing about a car. And then I heard a voice behind me. Having trouble with that thing, are you? And I turned, and standing behind me was a little short white woman with a pipe in her mouth, with a stick, standing along the road. And I said, I don't know what happened. Well, she said, looks like it needs to kind of cool off. I live right back over here, she said. Come on, take a load off your feet and rest a spell. If you need to, you can use my telephone. I followed her to her home, and we settled down on the porch, and she offered me a little of her pipe, or her can of snuff, as I remember. And she said to me, where you going? What you doing? What you going to do when you get there? I said, I'm on my way to Jonesboro, Tennessee to tell stories. I'm a professional storyteller. And she said, she said, well, how do you tell those professional stories? She said, you get paid for it? I said, yes. Ooh, she said, that's something new. She said, I know a whole bunch of people be millionaires now. I told her a story, and as I told my story, I noticed there was something about her that changed all of a sudden. And when I said, that's all of my story, she said, I got me a story. She said, I've been telling this story all my life. But lately, folks kind of, I guess because I'm so old, I'm 98, she said, and I guess people think I'm a little crazy when I tell it. But it is the absolute truth. I said, well, I must hear it. She said, come, help me down off the steps, and I'll show you where it all started. We walked a well-worn path around her house, and behind her little house, there was a little mountain house. Never had a drop of paint on it. But there in the front, the porch stoops were held up by two carved horses. She said, that's where I grew up. I had 8 brothers and sisters. She said, every one of them dead now. She said, they used to sleep in the loft. I slept up there too, but I was the baby. And I never could get warm. They'd always take the cover away from me. So my daddy built me a bed beside the fireplace. And that's where I slept. I used to like to be the first one to get up every morning. I'd see my mama stirring in a great big pot of grits in the fireplace, and I loved to smell them grits. Didn't know till I was grown grits didn't have no smell. And I was always the first one to get a big bowl of grits. But I remember waking up one morning to something real different. And then she said to me, don't you step up on that porch. She said, this old house is rotten and it's got holes in it. And she said, I don't think them boards will take your weight. You ain't no lightweight, you know. She said, come on, let's go back. And we went back to her porch. And as she told me this story, I watched a 98-year-old woman turn into a 5-year-old child. I remember that morning, she said. It was cold. And I turned over and I said, Papa, I'm cold. Mama, I'm hungry. But there was nobody about. And I looked up just to see my sisters and brothers all standing in a huddle about my mama's door. And I said, where's Papa? And Papa pushed my brothers and sisters aside and walked over to me and said, let your sister put your clothes on. I want you to stand outside and wait on old Doc. Wait on old Doc? Papa, I don't want to go out there. It's cold out there. Show Doc how to get in the house now. Oh, I don't want to do that. It's cold out there. Where's Mama? And my papa looked at me, and I knew not to say no more. My sister helped me put my clothes on, and I put my scarf around my head, and I thought, that's all right. Old Doc gives me candy. He gets it out of his pocket, and when I take the lint off of it, it's good candy. So I'll go out and get me some candy. And I ran to the front porch, and I kept waiting for old Doc's buggy to come down the road. But it was getting colder and colder. But then I saw him, and I waved at him. And he stopped that buggy in front of the house. And he tied up that mule. And he walked right past me. I waited to get my candy. But he went on in the house. And I thought, I'll get him when he comes out. But I waited on him, and I waited, and after a while I heard something in the house, something that was awfully strange, something that sounded like, no, 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 and that scared me. And I opened the door, and I looked in, and my brothers and sisters were crying. And I saw my papa come out holding his head, screaming, no. And I said, Papa, what's wrong? And my mama's bedroom door was open. So I slipped through the door. And I saw old Doc pulling the quilt back over my mama. And I ran to the bed and I said, Doc, is Mama cold? Papa ain't made no fire. And I grabbed my mama's hand, and I put her hand to my face, and I said, Mama, you ain't cold. Get up. Get up. But that's when my papa grabbed me and said, come on, child. This ain't no place for you. And he took me to the fireplace, and he pulled my chair out, and he said, now you stay here out of the way. And I said, yes, sir. And I heard my papa tell my brother, go get Mr. John. He'll know what to do. And he sent my sister Sally down the road to get the women. And after a long time, the women came back with bags and boxes. And they went into my mama's room and they locked the door. And then I heard the wagon. I heard Mr. John's wagon back up to the door. And they opened the front door, and they lifted a great pine box from the back of the wagon. And they took it to my mama's bedroom door and unlocked the door and took it in. And I said to Papa, what? He said, I'll be back, child. And after a long time, they placed 2 chairs before the fireplace. And they brought that long box and they placed it between the chairs. And they all went out and left me there alone. And I wondered, what's in that box? And I put my chair there. And I stood up on it. And there was a nail holding the top. And I turned that nail. And I lifted the top of that box. And I pushed it open. And I looked inside. It was my mama. And I said, "Get up, Mama. Get up. You got to give me some breakfast." And my papa grabbed me and pulled me from my chair. And the top of the box slammed shut. And he turned the nail and he said, "I told you, keep your seat." And I said, "Yes, sir." And the next day, they put my mama's box on a wagon. And we all climbed on the wagon. And my papa drove the wagon to the church. And I sat beside my mama's box. And they took the box into the church. And we followed. But I fell asleep. My sister woke me up and she said, "It's all over." And I said, "What's all over?" And I looked for my mama's box, but it was nowhere. And I ran to the door. They had put it on the wagon. And I ran toward the wagon because I wanted to be the first one to sit beside my mama's box. But my papa said, "We have to walk this time, child." And I walked along, holding my papa's hand. And I watched him. I saw the tears meeting beneath his chin. And nobody told me why they were crying. And just as we got to the bridge that crossed over the creek into the graveyard, Mr. John was leading my papa's 2 white horses. And the horses wouldn't move. And Mr. John took the whip and he said, "Get on. Go on there. Move." And the horses laid down. And Mr. John gave the whip to my papa. And he said, "Jim, them's your mules. Get them off of here." And my papa took that whip and he beat them mules. "Get on there. Get on there." And my sister Sally said, "Papa, don't you see? They don't want to go." And the men picked up my mama's box and they carried it across the bridge. And they put it down beside this great big old hole. And somebody gave me a handful of dirt and said, "Throw it in there." And I said, "No. Let's take Mama home. It's time to take Mama home. It's cold here. It's dirty here. We can't go any further. We can't take Mama no further. We have to take her home." And that's when my papa must have realized that he hadn't explained to me. He hadn't told me that we couldn't take Mama home no more. And I started crying. And I must have cried myself to sleep, because when I woke up, I was at home in my own bed. And it was dark in the room. But I could make out a candle on the mantelpiece just a little glow. And it was so quiet. It was quiet until I heard my papa's voice. And I looked around to find him, and he was standing at the window. And I heard him say, "My God, why ain't this night over? Why don't this night just be over? Something ain't natural out there. Is something wrong?" And I sat up. I sat up to listen. And I could hear what I thought was Papa's old hunting hounds. Oh, oh. Papa said, "Why? Why do they sound like that?" And he walked toward the door. And we heard something else. Who? Who? Ooh. Papa said, "What is that? That old owl?" And that's when we heard it. The screen door. Yeah. Papa said, "Who's there? Who's there?" And that's when we heard the voice. "Jim, Jim, let me in. It's cold out here. Please let me in." Papa said, "Go away. You ought not be playing with me. I ain't opening that door tonight. Get away from here. Please, Jim. I'm hurt something awful. Please help me." And I said, "Papa, Papa, that sounds like Mama." And I threw my legs over the side of the bed. And I started toward the door, but my papa said, "Get back in the bed. Don't you open that door." But I had lifted the latch. And I started to pull the door open. And my papa said, "No, child, don't you open that door." But I opened it, and there standing in the door was my mama. I said, "Mama, you've come home. They told me you couldn't come home no more." But my mama didn't seem to see me. She walked right by me. Her dress was wet and muddy. And she held her hands high beneath her chin, and I could see blood dripping from her fingers. And I said, "Mama." And my papa was moving away toward the center of the room. "Elvie," he said, "Elvie, go back. Go back to the grave." Mama said, "Jim, I told you to be careful. I told you about that sleeping sickness that I had. I could hear everything. I felt one of my children tugging at my hand, but I couldn't say a word. I felt that quilt fall back on my face, but I couldn't move. I heard the top of that old box slam shut. I heard the dirt falling in on me. And I felt the chill of that grave creeping through me. And all I could think was, "My God, are you going to let me die like this?" And then I heard something else. I heard voices. And I heard digging and scraping. And I felt fresh air, and somebody feeling over my face and in my mouth and trying to get my ring from my finger. It was grave robbers. It was grave robbers. My hands were stiff and swollen, and they couldn't move that ring from my finger. So they took cold steel to my hand and they cut off my ring finger. And it brought me back, and I sat up. And when I did, they come out of that grave screaming and hollering for all they was worth. And when they were gone, and I figured out what I had to do, I come out of that grave too. And I come home. I ain't dead. I ain't dead. And my papa grabbed my mama, and he wrapped up her hand, and he called all my sisters and brothers, and we couldn't stay away from Mama. She was back and she was alive. But as we all stood around, we heard a noise behind us. And when we looked around, we saw Papa loading a shotgun. And when he closed it up, he said to Mama, "Did you see them? Did you see the grave robbers?" And my mama said, "Yes, sir, I did." And Papa said, "Name them." My mama said, "No, sir. Don't you understand? Had it not been for them, I wouldn't have been able to come back to my family. I'll never tell who it was." And you know what? Said the old woman, "My mama never told. But I kind of believe that I always knew who it was. Because every Sunday morning, me and my mama would walk in church together. And she'd always stop at the back of the church. And she would speak quietly to two old men who sat back there. And they'd speak politely to my mama. I think I always knew, because I'd see her rubbing her hands when we took our seat. My papa went out in the woods and he cut down an oak tree and he carved the shapes of them two white horses and he put them here on the porch stoop, because Papa said animals know. And you see, them two old white horses knew my mama wasn't dead and wouldn't cross the creek with her box. But nobody listened to them. My mama lived to 1937. And when she died, I had 5 doctors pronounce her dead. Because I had promised her. And that's the end of that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You smell so good, I'm going to stay here.